Hey, good morning, everybody. This is Jim Sanford with NextLabs, and we're here to talk this morning about Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, CMMC, one of the big buzzwords coming out in the industry these days. It's all about the management of controlled unclassified information and data security for your organization. So CMMC comes with various levels of maturity. Today, we're going to talk about how to achieve them, a couple of common use cases for them, and the urgency on developing a system security plan for the bedrock applications that drive your business. We're joined today by Rob White and Randy Langmead from Siemens and Dave Vanderpool from Deloitte. These guys are some acknowledged experts in this space, and they have direct personal experience in dealing with CMMC and CUI. Just as a preamble, don't forget that this webinar is being recorded. And with that behind us, let me hand this over to Randy Langmead from Siemens. Our agenda today is pretty simple. Let me get through that real quick. That brief preamble you just saw. And then Randy's going to talk about CMMC, the importance of CMMC, and Dave Vanderpool is going to talk about what happens if you don't do this. We'll talk about those use cases and a couple of compliance solutions, and then we'll have some Q&A. So with that, go ahead.
Well then, good morning. Controlled unclassified information is a classification data where it's not necessarily classified data, but if you get enough data in aggregate, it can become critical to federal missions and business functions. And that doesn't impact the economic and national security interests of the United States. And so there's a need from the Department of Defense to control that unclassified information that aggregates. And it's around big programs. There's a lot of unclassified work that goes on big programs that as you aggregate that data into larger pockets, you can give information that can be reused. And, here are some simple examples of, the F-35 JSF and its replica overseas, and, one of our X-47B drones, for the carrier, and what it looks like when that information gets out into the wild uncontrolled. And this is what's driving the Defense Department to take a closer look, and the Department of Defense in general, at protecting this DoD information.
Thanks, Randy. Yeah, so I think today we'll spend a lot of time here talking about DFARS clause 7012 that some of you may be familiar with, as well as there's a FAR clause that's 52.204.21. And really what this is about controlling data, controlled unclassified data residing on a contractor's internal system, and make sure that us as an industry that we're protecting that data from cyber incidents. The DFARS clause, the 7012 clause, make sure that we deal with any consequences associated with the loss of any info, and that we minimize any incidents. Actually, not minimize any incidents, but minimize the impacts of anything that happens via the cyber reporting requirements in that clauses C through G. DoD provides a single DoD-wide approach to safeguarding covered information and contractor information systems. And then they also want to prevent proliferation of multiple, potentially different safeguarding controlled. So ultimately, we want to prevent proliferation of, multiple potentially different safeguarding controlled classified system information clauses. So, we're doing that by contract language, excuse me, across various entities across the DoD. So what is the DFARS cybersecurity requirement? So this is a clause contractually that goes to contractors as well as flowing down to subs. And it's making sure that we provide adequate security for covered defense information, CDI, that resides or in transit through a contractor's internal information system or network. So this isn't necessarily for something that's in a DoD system, but something that's in your internal network itself. It gives you the mechanism and the rules on how to report a cyber incident that affects a covered contractor information system, right? So it gives you kind of the playbook on exactly what to do when you have an incident, who to call, where to report it to, and so forth. It gives you a mechanism to submit malicious software that you discover and report that to the DoD Cyber Crime Center. And then if requested, it also gives you the methodology on how to submit data or media for additional damage assessment. And the other thing that we do is make sure that you have a flow down clause. So if we bring in a subcontractor, anything that we do that we agree to in that FAR clause is 7012, we also flow down to our subcontractors as well. So what is covered defense information? So a lot of times you'll hear CDI, CUI, CTI, and a lot of these things interchangeably, but really it's unclassified controlled technical information. And it's covered in the Controlled Unclassified Information Registry. So there's a website here where you can go look that up, and we'll make that available to you. Includes technical information, includes ITAR. So this is one that's always tricky, right? So folks come to me and ask a lot of times, hey, this is ITAR, is it CUI information? And a lot of times that depends on whether you're using that ITAR work in support of a government contract or not, right? So a good example is something maybe ITAR, let's say a small arms manufacturer that really, markets to U.S., let's say the hunters and so forth, right? That data is different than somebody that's creating small arms for the federal government. So this is, I'm not going to read through all of this, but these are some of the different DoD distribution statements. So as we talk about NIST and we talk about CMMC, all the data is going to have to be marked. And this is an example of kind of what and how the data will be marked. So the dissemination limitations, the reasons, the date, and the controlling organizations. So safeguarding requirements. So the 7012 clause, which I keep referring back to, requires that CDI, CUI must and may only be stored, managed, and transmitted on information systems and platforms that are compliant to the NIST standards. So there's a NIST standard special publication 800-171, and contractors must certify their compliance to standards for any and all digital CDI in any form, in whole or in part. So as we go into the CMMC discussion today. So this is something that industry has been able to self-attest to in the past. So there's about 110 controls, and us as an industry, we go through, we kind of check the boxes. But as you can see, coming forward with the new requirements that David will talk to here momentarily, those things will be changing. So as I just discussed, we're on the NIST 800-171 with 110 controls. That was a method for companies to self-attest to the fact that they had the controls in place to receive controlled unclassified information. So I'm going to hand this off to Dave in a second, but the Cyber Maturity Model Certification, CMMC, as you guys have all been hearing about, is this new certification framework that's really there to make sure that we are doing things properly. So this is where the government has told us that, you've done your best, but your best isn't quite good enough, and you're going to need a third party to come in and make sure that you're doing things properly. David, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. And as Rob and Randy mentioned, Cyber Maturity Model Certification, or CMMC, is fast coming. Its overall intent, as was just mentioned, is to control and protect contract information and controlled unclassified information, or CUI. It has 5 levels of certification, and while the dates have been moving for when the certification will take place, the ultimate requirement is that organizations will be expected, if they want to do business with the DoD, to comply with one or multiple levels of the CMC certification. Companies should expect that if they're doing work with the DoD, that all of their RFIs, proposals, and contracts will start incorporating CMC elements over the next year or so. So at the end of the day, on the right side of this chart, you'll see a lot of risks of non-compliance. But at the end of the day, organizations doing work with the DoD should consider the CMMC to be a quote-unquote license to do business with the government. And what that means is that this will not be a differentiator per se. It will be a base expectation and part of the expectations that the DoD has. And organizations should expect that a third-party assessor will be auditing your organization on the maturity and compliance towards CMMC. So as your organization evaluates the transition and incorporation of the CMMC levels and maturity, be sure to factor in the cost of non-compliance, right? The ability to, or lack of ability to do work with the DoD going forward. And on the next slide, we'll highlight some use cases and risks of CMMC or lack of CMMC compliance. So from left to right are some example use cases that organizations we know of are having to go through or struggling with. So on the left, controlling data in internal environments, what does that mean for an organization? And to the one next to it, sometimes that information will not be controlled in your information security systems or in your processes. They'll actually be housed in a DoD environment. So the controls need to cover both scenarios. So be sure to cover both scenarios in your CMMC assessments that you're doing in planning that you're doing inside your organizations. In the middle, what happens when your organization gets certification level 2, for example, but you get an RFI that requires level 3? So not achieving the right level of certification will actually prevent award for certain contracts, or that's the expectation. So again, in your CMMC assessment and roadmap and planning exercises, be sure to understand the needs of each level and have a plan to address each of those levels. So if something like this occurs where you get an RFI or an RFP for a level of compliance above where you are today, that's not a surprise, and you're able to adjust your roadmap to incorporate those levels wherever possible. And on the right is actually probably the primary topic for today, and it's actually one of the areas that organizations are the most concerned about, is that CMMC compliance covers the organizations in your supply chain as well. So as you're going through the levels of maturity, questions will be, and the expectation will be that your suppliers are going along that journey and are compliant as well. And that's part of your compliance. So this is clearly non-trivial, as some suppliers may not be far along the journey, and there's also a risk that a supplier will fail an audit during a contract or during a program. So again, this is a major topic that we want to talk about today, but it's also probably the hardest piece to wrap your mind around, and what we're seeing organizations struggle with, as again, each of the suppliers in that you're all working with are at different levels of maturity, and they're at different levels of understanding of this requirement and what's coming, and having a plan to attack it. So on the next slide, a range of what other companies are doing in this space. And while there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer, on the left side of this chart, some organizations are saying the cost of compliance is extremely high. We don't really understand this yet, so we're going to take a wait and see approach to see what others end up doing and what comes out of the audits that the third-party assessor will take. And on the right side of this chart, there are companies who are saying, we know this is coming, we understand it enough, and we understand the implications are so big that we need a very robust plan in place to address this now, so we don't risk a contract issue when the actual requirements take effect. And of course, this is not binary, there's levels in the middle as well. So while the risk of non-compliance goes down as you move to the right on this chart of additional effort and planning and strategy to incorporate, also the costs go up. So we recognize that as well. So there's not necessarily a right answer, but recognize that the further left you are on this chart as your organization, the higher the risk there is that as these requirements take effect, that your organization might not be able to be compliant or be awarded a new contract. So what does this all mean? And what should you actually get started with now? So on the next slide, we'll talk through some 4 steps that we all recommend every organization start doing. So we get a lot of questions on what is CUI, like what's the definition? While there are definitions and there's standards out there, what does that mean for your organization, and defining your CUI boundary? And especially this comes into the play when you look at the 5 levels of CMMC maturity and saying, which level is most likely suitable for us? What's the type of data that's going to pass through our environment? What's the information that's happening that we're working on with the government? And therefore, which level of maturity should we target in the short term? And as the next step, looking at the contractual landscape. So looking at existing contracts that are likely to transition over to the CMMC requirements in the short run, and then also saying what's on our 1, 2, 3, 5-year roadmap of of likely contracts, and where do we expect the level of compliance to be required in order to bid and win those contracts. So again, there's not a surprise at the last minute that a contract requires level 3 when you're at level 2. And then of course, developing a plan, right? So most organizations already have a system security plan or a plan of action to address elements of CMMC, but develop a strategy for the organization saying, this is the level we're trying to hit. This is what it means for our organization. And these are the steps we're going to take to burn this down. So by the time the audits start, we're ready and we know we're going to pass the compliance. And then the last step, again, which is very much the topic for today and perhaps the hardest part, is as a part of that strategy for CMMC, evaluating and developing an action plan for how we're going to control our suppliers and our supply chain. So again, just if take away nothing else from this conversation right now, the supplier's compliance is a part of your organization's compliance of CMMC. So making sure that there's a very clear action plan and prioritization plan to confirm that the suppliers are able and willing to go along this journey with you, and that they will ultimately maintain compliance through the life of the project. So on this topic of supply chain compliance, I know for today's session, we're going to talk a lot about this and around how digital rights management using Siemens and NextLabs technology will help enable this capability. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jim to talk through the use cases for today.
Thanks a lot, Dave. That's really good information. Let's talk about a business scenario, you guys. So Acme LLC is a manufacturing company headquartered in North America. We make a bunch of engine components. There's a lot of companies just like this everywhere we see. But they're targeting to get the CMMC certification by 2023 to be able to do business with the DoD. However, with NIST 800-171, it's a mandate to get certified. Otherwise, they will not be eligible for DoD, and non-compliance could lead to a loss of current and future government contracts. So Acme is a great bunch of people, right? And they've currently built some controls in applications containing sensitive data, and they're comfortable with self-certifying those controls. However, there are gaps in controlling unclassified information, CUI, in different applications, and Teamcenter is one of their key bedrocks. The director of cybersecurity, Mr. Ed Tyler, wanted to transform the cybersecurity function with an objective to achieve CMMC compliance and continue to maintain it. But like a lot of companies, you guys, he is facing a lot of challenges in realizing this vision around CUI. He has CUI must be safeguarded to prevent unauthorized disclosure. CUI needs to be monitored and protected with proper safeguarding using authentication and encryption or digital rights management before sharing. And he needs the ability to manage access to CUI across different application stacks using a centralized system for rules and policies. All right, so let's talk about use case number 1. We safeguard CUI with digital rights management. The scenario looks like this. When it comes to CUI in the form of unstructured data, files, PDFs, 3D graphics, .prt files, etc., in order to be compliant with CMMC, it is mandatory that such files are protected with digital rights management before sharing. Examples of such CUI include design documents, intellectual property documents, sensitive financial information, CAD drawings, assemblies, JT files, things like that sit in a discrete file. Teamcenter's authorized data access model, which you guys know as ADA, ensures that only authorized users can download data from Teamcenter. However, after data is downloaded into a file, it needs to be protected so that only authorized users, either internal or external, can access the data both internally or when it is shared or sent to people outside the organization, like down a supply chain. In this use case, we're going to demonstrate how to prevent unauthorized data extraction to stop data loss using policy enforcement and digital rights management. So in this use case 1, we're going to have Ed, Jin, and Sanjay, all from Acme, but each from a different Acme facility. Ed is going to have access to the entire transmission assembly. Jin is only going to be able to work on the transmission case, and Sanjay can work on the transmission control subassembly. Each of them have an authorization stack that controls their access to information, as you'll see.
We will start the demonstration by having Ed sign into SkyDRM. Once Ed signed in, he's notified that he's now online. And now Ed can go in and also sign in from his desktop into Team Center as well. So he'll be signed into both SkyDRM locally on his desktop, as well as signing into Team Center from that same desktop. Once Ed is into Team Center, he can load up and take a look at that transmission assembly that we spoke about earlier on that we'll be using during the demonstration. Here you can have a breakdown of the different components, and here we will see the IP classification. You can also go in and look at the properties itself in more detail and go down through, and here we'll see the IP classification that was specified, which, as you remember, we defined within policy to be used for users' access into these files if they're allowed or not allowed access. Ed will now take a look through the structure manager, and here we can see a breakdown of all the materials. In this case, we're going to see that as well as the IP classifications that are specified for each of these parts and the assembly itself. So here we can have a drop down look at the values. He could change these up if need be, depending on the needs, as well as the NextLabs being able to protect that, which is one of the seamless integrations between Team Center and SkyDRM. Here you can take a look at the full assembly of the transmission. He can now load up the NX client. In this case, we get the full view from the NX client of the transmission as well as the subassembly. So since Ed is in the headquarters, he has full access to the entire transmission and the subassembly, which you're seeing on the right-hand side. He can go in and look at the different rights that's been applied to it from NextLabs. So in this case, we're going to get a listing of information that'll show, based on each of these parts, what they can actually do with them. So in this case, view, print, save, so on and so forth. Or if a part's not protected, it also shows that as well. Ed can now go out and export this transmission assembly. In this case, he's exported to a local drive. And here we will see all the parts that are listed as well as the .nxl extension, which means that these are all protected by NextLabs. Here you can go out in NextLabs, view the file information for a particular part, and it'll show what's been applied. So view, print, reshare, save as. Again, you can look at different parts and show the different rights that are applied to each of these. He'll now go in and look at the subfolder of transmission casing, so we can see other assembly parts and pieces that are available that have been downloaded. Now we're going to go out and sign in as Jin. If you remember, Jin is one of the users that's from China, from Acme China, and he's going to sign on to SkyDRM as well. And now he's going to take a look at those same parts that have been downloaded to that desktop. So in this case, when he views the information and tries to load it up, the SkyDRM viewer will show him what he has access to. So in this case, since he's from Acme China, he has a view of the case itself. So he doesn't get to see the entire assembly, just the case and the associated parts of that. Here we'll see that if he views another file, it'll load up and he can actually see a breakdown of the case components in the different pieces that make up the entire case assembly. But again, not being able to see the subassembly components since he doesn't have access to them. Here we'll see that he can go in unmanaged mode, so this way not connecting to the Team Center instance that Ed was on, and look at it through the NX client. So here he can do a view. It'll load up what he's chosen as far as a part or the assembly itself. And now we'll see that those are the files that he cannot view and cannot be opened, but he can view the case and all the components that make that part up that he has access to. And you'll see the other ones are grayed out. And the objects that he can view, he might have only read-only access to, and he can uncheck or check the ones that he can see, but the other ones will remain grayed out and he doesn't have the access to them. He can also look at the file rights here. And again, it's going to show the same thing that we saw earlier, where the ones that he can't see and the ones that he can see in this case are protected, and what he has capabilities for those particular files that he could see. Now our last user, Sanjay, if you remember, Sanjay's from India LLC, Acme. He's going to go out. He's logged in through SkyDRM desktop. And again, he can view and look at those parts through the SkyDRM viewer as well. But as you can see here, he can see the subassembly components. He does not see any part of the case because he doesn't have access to it. Here he can expand out the list again. Again, sign in through the NX client in unmanaged mode and look at a particular part. When he opens it up, here we'll see that there are certain parts that are protected again because he doesn't have access to them, but he does have access to the ones that he's allowed based on policy decision that was made based on that user and the attributes of both the files as well as what was defined within Active Directory. So here he can see that subassembly but can't see any of the case. So here, based on the three users looking at the same files, have different views of what they can and cannot view, and that's all based on SkyDRM and its ability to protect certain parts of the assembly from users and them having the ability to access it. And here we'll see Sanjay at the end being able to use the SkyDRM viewer and view the subassembly.
So when we take a look at use case number 2, we're focusing on supplier collaboration. The scenario is this. Only Acme LLC users with the appropriate attributes can see the entire transmission assembly and parts therein. Ed Tyler, you remember him from the first use case, uses Team Center and can see the entire transmission assembly at any time. Ed needs to share the assembly, though, with suppliers outside of Acme LLC, but he has to ensure that the suppliers only have access to the parts they are authorized to see. Ed will need to monitor the files to ensure the supplier does not accidentally share the data with unauthorized personnel, as well as be able to revoke permissions to the file, after which the supplier will no longer have access to it. In this example, we'll look at how to securely collaborate with suppliers while monitoring how the files are used and revoking access to the file when it is no longer required. Once again, you see that there are 3 users. There's Ed from Acme, but now, versus use case 1, we have Ross and Claudine who work for contractors and suppliers outside of Acme LLC. They have permissions, as you see there. Ed is the data owner, and Ross and Claudine can only touch the engine transmission case. Each of them has an authorization model, as you see there.
We will start off the demonstration by having Ed sign into SkyDRM. You remember, he's the project manager. So Ed will have a full view of all the projects that the other users will access. In this case, the Engine Transmission 100 project, the Engine Fork project, the Engine Cases project, and the Engine Bearings project as well. Here we'll see Steve is one of the members under the Engine Bearing project. Ross is a member under the Engine Cases project. Ed can now go into the Engine Transmission 100 project, and we will see the files that he has available that are now protected by NextLabs. And in this case, he will look at the information based on policy that's been defined against these files. In this case, we're looking at the casing that he wants to go out and share with the other users. Here we can see rights for other files and the classifications for that file as well. So if we go back to the casing, he's now going to do a share on the file. So this will bring up a screen that will show the different projects. In this case, he will check off the engine cases and share that protected file with the engine cases project. Here, if he takes a look at the log now, you'll see that Ed has protected that file and now shared that file. So in this case, we can see the activity already of what's going on from the start of this file from when he first protected it. Now we'll go in and have Ross log in. If you remember, Ross is a tier 1 contractor. So here we will see Ross is a member of the engine cases project. He can go out and take a look at the files that were shared in this case with his project. And here we will see that Ed had shared from the engine transmission 100 project the case. He can look at the information for this and see that he has the full rights as well to view, print, reshare, and share as. In this case, Ross will go out and be able to reshare as well, since he has that right to do that. He will look for the subcontractor engine case project that he wants to share with. In this case, he's going out and now shared this with that project. If we look at the files, we'll see that that case is now available. We'll see the members of the subcontractor engine case, in this case Claudine. Ross will now log out. Claudine will now log into SkyDRM. When Claudine scrolls down, you'll notice that she's just a member of the subcontract for engine case project. Here you'll see that she's a member of that along with Ross and Lewis. When she looks at the shared files, again, she will see that engine case that Ross reshared with her. So here she'll take a look at the information and see that she has the same rights as Ross did as far as the file is concerned. Here she can go out and do a reshare if she chooses to, since she has that capability, but in this case she's not going to reshare it with anybody else, but she's going to open up and take a look at it to see what it looks like. So here it will display within the SkyDRM viewer, and we can see that she can see the engine case. So she doesn't see the entire assembly, but she can see the engine case that's been shared with her. Claudine will now log out. And now we're going to have Ed, the project manager, log back in again to SkyDRM. So as mentioned before, Ed has access to all the projects. In this case, he's going to go into his original engine transmission 100 project and look at the files that he had shared. So here's the transmission assembly and here's the case. He can look at the log and see, as we looked at it before, that he was able to protect and share it. Ross reshared it, and Claudine was able to view it and looked at it a few times. At this point, Ed will see and look at the projects that he shared this with, and now he wants to revoke the rights to be able to look at that file. So in this case, he's going to do an update and successfully revoke the rights of the other projects to take a look at that case. So by him removing that, he can go back down, take a look at one of these other projects, and look at the files, and you'll see that that case is no longer in the shared with this project folder. So now we're going to log back in as Ross. In this case, when Ross goes down and opens up the engine case and looks at the files that were shared with him, you'll no longer see that engine case that's available that was shared before. So since Ed revoked it, he no longer is able to see that file. Now we'll log in as Claudine. When Claudine logs in and goes down into her project, if you remember, Ross reshared it with her. Now, in this case, there are no files there. So that one shared file for that case is no longer there. So as you can see, since it was from the start of Ed sharing it, he can also revoke it, and then that's revoked down the entire chain through.
Hey, you guys, so that's that. We've shown a couple of use cases. We've defined a few of the bits around CMMC and talked about the way controlled unclassified information might work. Now's the time for Q&A. And so we've got a couple questions already queued up. If you need to ask one, please just drop it in the Q&A chat, and we'll get to it right now. The first one is for Rob White, most likely, I think. And it is, are there any government entities which have CMMC requirements other than the DoD?
Yeah, this is David. I can actually take that. So, and Robert, feel free to add in. So CMMC is being led through the DoD so far. There is an intent that this becomes broadly applicable across other departments as well. But the definitions and the initial intent and all of the documentation and the audit requirements so far are being driven through the DoD. Again, with the intent that long-term this becomes applicable across agencies.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. Appreciate it, Dave. Another question, a great one from Gretchen Prater. Thank you, Gretchen. What is the benefit of revoking access when they had access previously and could have printed the file and therefore have long-term access to the file? Yeah, I'll start with that one, Gretchen. So a lot of this, a lot of the material that you see right now is 3D data. It has a whole bunch of digital definition. It's got a bunch of arithmetic and math and graphics and BREPs in it, such that a solid part, a .prt file, is more than just something you would print per se. And so the ability to reach down into the history of that file and to tell it, no matter where it's gone on the earth, to dissolve in place is extremely important. So revoking access and choking off that data wherever it sits in whatever form it is very important. Secondly, because you use something like NextLabs and you have digital rights, you can prevent their ability to print. So don't forget the digital rights includes the ability to print. And we're happy to show you how that works if you'd like. Another question, do all NIST 800-171/CMMC controls apply equally to all in-scope systems?
I think I understand the question. And just as a quick reminder, this is very much in pilot mode within the CMMC and the DoD so far. So I think they've only started rolling this out for select programs. So a lot of this is changing, but the latest guidance has been, the answer to your question basically is no. So the controls will need to be in place for where they're required. For example, if you have a supplier, they may not, by definition, have to have the same level of certification that you all are, depending on the need. So again, getting into kind of the next question of what are some of the minimum levels, the levels are based on the type of information that will pass through your systems that you'll be responsible for, and what's required for the program. So, to merge these questions together, if a supplier is only providing commercial off-the-shelf components, they likely would not need a level maybe higher than 1, because that's kind of the level 1 is that you have control over information. And your organization might, for example, need to be at level 3, where you're able to protect at least at a basic level CUI. So there's not an easy answer to some of these "what do I need to do" questions, but that's kind of the general guidance that we're hearing so far.
So that was a nice combination of those two questions, the answer of those two questions. That's great. Thank you. So Gretchen, so they're not able to save the file to the local computer system. Once again, digital rights lets you determine what's going to happen with that file. And in the event that they do save it to their local computer system, local computer, whatever, it doesn't matter, because the digital rights and the security is actually contained with the data. So this is the beautiful thing about things like NextLabs and digital rights management and attribute-based access control, the data contains its own security. So yeah, they could save it because you allowed them to save it. You said, yes, you're allowed to save, Mr. Client, and they go about their work, and you can revoke their rights at any time. That doesn't mean that that file is not still protected because they saved it locally. They saved it locally, and you revoked access, and it dissolves in place. And the next time they try to open it, it is just nothing but gibberish. And by the way, one of the beautiful things about it, about the way we've instantiated this, is that not only is it gibberish, the data phones home to let us know that you tried to access it again, even after we revoked access. Very good question. So Chris Whittick asks, I'm a bit confused about the controls applicable to CMMC. When I read resources, I see references to 800-171, but when I look at 171, that document references 800-53. So are there any unique 171 controls, or is 171 essentially a wrapper for 800-53? That is for a CMMC expert like Dave or Rob.
And Rob, feel free to chime in. So these standards, like 171 is not just a wrapper for 853. It includes other pieces, and it includes references to other standards as well. So it's not limited to 800-53. And then for CMMC, the intent is not just to provide a standard, but to provide levels of maturity of compliance. So I think, going off the top of my head, I believe level 2 requires 800-171 compliance, and then level 3 adds in additional compliance around CUI. So I recognize that these are confusing terms because typically a lot of these standards reference each other. So long story short, 800-171 references -53, but it's not only 53. So it's one element of 171, and then CMMC is intended to be the maturity across a number of standards, including these, so that there can be a certification level applied and where your organization is along the journey. So I recognize it's complex. Hopefully that answers the question though.
Great,
Thanks,
thank
Dave.
you.
I just figured out how to get off mute. So
Yeah, Rob, anything you want to add is welcome.
no, it's perfect, Dave. Thanks.
So Sucker Pinar asks a question: does CMMC and NIST standards include export controls compliance, or are there any other regulations or standards for export controls for IT systems and data?
Yeah, so CUI by definition covers all unclassified information that needs to be confidential. So it's a broader term that does include pieces around export control, so ITAR and other types of export control. That is part of the intent of CUI, is to be a broader definition of what needs to be controlled more than just export control. So it's a broader term than export control. So yes, it does include export controls.
Cool.
It doesn't intend to replace, for example, like ITAR license requirements. It's not that. It's to protect additional information beyond what is typically handled under ITAR, et cetera, and EAR.
Yeah, so under ITAR, I'm still going to have an export control license for a given component, and that is just a subset of CMMC, if you will.
Correct.
But like Rob said, it's where the data is intended use. So you could have ITAR control data that is like Rob's example was for a hunter and munitions that had export control, but it wasn't on a defense program.
Fair. Yeah, totally makes sense. Okay, very cool. Thank you. Elaine Condrotas asks a question: would it be required to have the individual looking at the data be certified, or does the certification go to the organization? Good question.
Yes, so far it's the organization that it will be certified, and that of course means that the processes are in place and the individuals are following those processes in place to be controlled.
Yeah, you're assuming that the process sits at the organizational level and it's being managed, and that the people sit inside of it. Yep. Okay. Ken Butler says, do companies need to maintain enclaves within their systems to segregate DoD program A from program B, even though A and B have the same CUI requirements?
Not necessarily. That's not necessarily a requirement just by definition of having a different program. There are scenarios where that would need to be the case. And again, enclaves is kind of a broad term, and nice to see you. But that is not necessarily a CMMC requirement that every program has to be fully segregated.
Yeah, usually folks will just kind of define what their boundary is and then kind of have all their programs within that boundary, right? To make sure that everything in that boundary has applicable controls.
Very cool. All right, thank you. Gretchen asked a good question. I'll jump in. She says, is the subcontractor using their own instance of NX or using the Prime's instance? So Gretchen, NX is just a user interface, right? It could be Creo, SolidWorks, NX. That's the beautiful thing about NextLabs. We have deep, what's called the rights management extensions for all those applications. But more importantly, the CAD system or the user interface that you're referring to can be in unmanaged or managed mode. And to answer your question directly, it does not matter whether they're using NX, Creo, SolidWorks, unmanaged or managed, or with their own Team Center instance or a different Team Center instance or the Prime's Team Center instance. It's immaterial because the data is carrying its own security along with it. So once this stuff has been secured and once digital rights have been applied to it, essentially think about this as a package that has a payload in it. And the payload is the .prt file that you might open with NX. And the wrapper around it is the security engine. And so independent of where it's now sitting, whether it's inside of a Team Center instance or sitting on an open drive or emailed to your aunt or uncle on accident, the data is still secured because it's still wrapped up in that wrapper. So it doesn't really matter which instance of Team Center or what user interface you're accessing the data with. You are very welcome, Chris. Happy to share this information with you as well. Wendy McNeil asks a question: does the data resident in the Team Center volume carry the NextLabs digital rights, or is this repository outside of Team Center? If it's inside Team Center, where does a TC access control fit? Do users defined to have access by ED have to be users in Team Center, or is the application that is used by ED grant revoke access, some of the list, LDAP, whatever? Okay, so Wendy, we need to talk offline so as to not make this super long for the folks here. But the bottom line is this: the information sits exactly where it sits in Team Center. And it has a little tiny green star next to it, and that means it's been encrypted. And then if you take that information and you lob it outside of your Team Center environment, such that it is like, for instance, in the first use case, there are 3 Team Center environments. Okay, there's Acme LLC in the US, there's Acme in India, and there's Acme in China. And so that's 3 Team Center instances, and therefore at least 3 Team Center volumes. And so the information has this green dot around it, and you've grabbed it, tossed it over to another one, and then the security went with it. Now, when you apply digital rights, the instance of SkyDRM can either be adjacent to your Team Center stack if you'd like. It can be in a DMZ outside of it, or it can be in the cloud outside of all of them. All of those things work. So if you'd like to have an architecture discussion, please hit me up. I'm happy to dive in as deeply and boringly as you would like. Happy to talk about architecture anytime. Okay. Wendy has another one. As the certificate is on the file, what about the metadata? Yes. So Wendy, once again, we wrap the payload and the metadata with a .nxl wrapper. So, and that is what is now the protected entity. It includes the metadata, it includes the .prt file or whatever type file. And that we call that the payload, just in using our little slang. And there you go. So the certificate is not on the file. It is wrapped around the payload and the metadata associated with that file. Okay, I think that's about it. We have 13 open questions. No one else has piled on. All right, thanks everybody. This has been great. It's been a great 52 minutes so far. Here's the links to all the relevant people that have been on the phone today, the great folks from Deloitte. Appreciate your help, Dave. I appreciate it. Obviously, the two great folks from Siemens, Rob from Siemens Government Services, and Randy from actual Siemens DISW, the software guys. And I'm Jim Sanford. I'm from NextLabs, and that's us, nextlabs.com. Here's our contact details. We are happy to entertain any questions you've got, any commentary, happy to pile on, and we'll get all this information to you. With that, we appreciate your help. Have a fantastic day today. Enjoy your Thursday. Happy July 1st, everybody.